encouraging people to report wrongdoing and illegal activities is essential for corruption prevention. There's been widespread concern for the protection of whistleblowers in both the private and public sector. Corruption Watch has reported it receives an average of 4,000 reports of corruption annually, mostly from municipalities and police departments. But is there enough protection for these whistleblowers? Let's get that answer and more with Tendai Jangara, who's the Dispute Resolutions Director at Cliffe Dekker Hofmeyr. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon, Tendai. And maybe before we get into the specifics of the protection of whistleblowers, based on your engagements and your experience, what you are seeing, how bad is the situation when it comes to the lack of their protection?
Thank you very much for having me, Rafua. We're 25 years into our democracy. We've had legislation since 2000, the Protected Disclosures Act, and we still find that our whistleblowers are not fully protected when it comes to them reporting information about malfeasance in both the public and private sector. We see reports of retaliation, suffering through their personal lives, also with their employment, just based on the fact that they've chosen to make information available about wrongdoing.
Yeah. So with that then, what are some of the mechanisms that are available to improve the protection of those who choose to be brave enough to stand up against the corruption and malfeasance wherever they see it?
So currently, our whistleblowing legislation has the Public Protected Disclosures Act as the primary legislation that we deal with that looks at protecting our whistleblowers. We also find that in other pieces of legislation, including the Companies Act, there are sections which deal with the protection of whistleblowers within that context. Unfortunately, we find that our legislation is just not enough. So it's not strong enough to ensure that our whistleblowers, first of all, are protected from a legal perspective, but again, in terms of their lifestyle. So we're at a point in South Africa now where we're looking at our legislation, looking at our framework to see how we can improve it, to make sure that our protections, first of all, from a legislative perspective, are robust, but also practically. We need to ensure that practically when persons make reports, they actually are protected. So that is where we're going as a country now.
Yeah, are you able to give us a broad sense of what robust legislation would look like as it's currently been worked and reworked to make sure that there is increased protection? But what exactly would robust legislation look like?
So where we stand right now is that our Protected Disclosures Act deals specifically with the work environment. So it would be the relationship between an employer and the employee, and an employee coming forward and making reports. But as we know, not all reports happen within the work setting. We have stakeholders who become aware of information outside the employment setting. So the first thing we need to do is extend the definition of our whistleblowers so that it's not confined to the employment setting. The next thing we need to think about is where persons can report. We know that at the moment you can report within the employment setting. You can also go to Chapter 9 institutions, including the Public Protector and the Auditor General. But we need to now look at having an actual agency, a regulatory body that deals specifically with our whistleblowers. And when we think about whistleblowing, we have to think about the persons, not just the disclosures, but the persons who come forward. So we believe that having a body that deals with the person specifically outside of just the laws that we have and is actually empowered to ensure that our whistleblowers are protected is the way that we need to go.
And I'm sure it would also need to include some form of protection against unemployment, if you will. What we've seen over the last few years or so is that as soon as someone speaks out against malfeasance, they lose their jobs and they're becoming unemployable. In fact, some of them have had to flee the country. So would legislation have to look closely at that as well?
Absolutely. So you speak about people having to flee the country. We've seen Ethel Williams having to leave. We've had cases including Marcelo Mateko, who's now unemployed, Bianca Goodson. So we see a detrimental effect on the occupations of persons. Our legislation has to look at stopping that kind of retaliatory action At the moment, the case of Sarika Lakraj-Naidu is in the media. And having worked for the city, she's now in a position where she went through a disciplinary process and is going through an arbitration because she then faced retaliation after making a whistleblowing report. So we have to look at one, protecting the employment of our whistleblowers. They must not suffer retaliation. But where there is retaliation, we need to look at protecting their lifestyle. When someone loses their job, it means their livelihood is lost. Very often they have legal cases that they need to fight. Their reputations are damaged, which means they can't go into further employment. So a holistic approach is really needed in terms of protecting our whistleblowers beyond just their employment.
Yeah, and I'm sure the Labour Relations Act would come in here when there are issues, like you say, they've still got responsibilities, whether it be legal costs, but families that they still need to take care of. Does the Labour Relations Act help with that kind of compensation, or are there amendments that are needed there as well?
So we absolutely have to look at amendments when it comes to persons who either automatically lose their jobs as a result of whistleblowing or suffer occupational detriment, including unfair labor practices. Our law currently limits the amounts that persons can be compensated if they go the route of the labor court and take their cases there. So we see a maximum of 24 months compensation for unfair labor practices. And I'm sure you'd understand that that in no way will take care of a person who's maybe had a career of 30 years, loses their job, and still has a family to take care of.
Thank you very much for those insights, Tendai, for joining us this afternoon. Speaking about an important matter there around the whistleblowers in the country that have been brave enough to speak out against corruption or malfeasance in private and public institutions, and of course them being fired or losing their livelihoods as a result. So that was Tendai Jangara from CDH speaking to us about that particular matter.